Very good evening and welcome. You're watching live session on the economic outlook for India, powered by Investornomics, an initiative by ICICI Securities. Those of you who are watching this live, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, you can post your queries in the comment section below, and we'll try and take some of your questions towards the end of this session. So please send in your queries as soon as possible. Joining in now is Mr. P.K. Basu, Chief Economist at ICICI Securities. Very good evening, Mr. Basu, and thank you so much for joining in.
Good evening, Geethu. Good to be doing this for, I think, the 12th time.
Yes, lots to talk about since we are meeting for the first time post the budget session of 2023. But let me start with the latest, the recent developments. So, geopolitical scenario, the concerns are back with the Biden making a surprise visit to Ukraine, which comes just after China had talked about a peace plan for Ukraine-Russia conflict, and then Putin exiting from the nuclear deal with the US. What does this all mean for a country like India?
Well, I mean, it basically means that the war is being prolonged. There is no easy or early resolution. If anything, President Biden's visit to Ukraine ups the ante and provides a further boost to President Zelensky of Ukraine. And the language used by both of them suggests that there is no real scope for compromise and that they will continue to fight. The Ukrainians will receive substantially more aid, more military aid. It's extraordinary that Ukraine, when it was a peaceful country, used to struggle to obtain any kind of funding from the IMF. But on the front lines of the war, it's received $30 billion from the United States alone in the form of military assistance. And that has kept it going. So the war is certainly not anywhere near ending. And what that means is that we'll continue to see a little bit of tension over oil supplies. We'll continue to see some pressure on global food prices. Those Russia and Ukraine were major suppliers of wheat exports to the world. For edible oils, Ukraine is a major supplier. So these are going to remain in the backdrop. No real easy resolution to the situation, and that in some senses is bad news. But it's been a year now, exactly a year now since the war began. And I think the world has responded and has adjusted to the continuation of this war. And most economies have adjusted and are operating as if not too much has changed. India, in particular, I think is in relatively good shape. Inflation remains a major concern around the world, but as I've said repeatedly, inflation predated the Russia-Ukraine war in the developed world. Inflation in the United States, the core PCE inflation rate was already above 4% in October 2021. So 5 months before this Russia-Ukraine war began. And it is a monetary phenomenon, and now requires a monetary resolution, which is underway. The US is, of course, continuing to tighten monetary policy, and it will need to do a little bit more in order to wrestle inflation back down to closer to that 2% level that is the target for the Fed.
Is that why the markets are reacting negatively? Because now the chances of Fed tapering off the interest rate on the higher side, we were expecting that there might be a little 25 bips hike again, but now markets are expecting more than 50 bips hike to contain inflation. Is that what is bothering the markets more? And how is China placed between the two countries, like between the Russia and US?
Okay, let's address each of those questions separately. First of all, with regard to inflation, inflation hasn't moderated as much as would have been expected. We have to look out for the next core PCE inflation number, but the latest one is still 4.4%. That is for December. The January number should be out in a few days. That's still a very, very high inflation rate. So there is no real prospect of the Fed taking its foot off the pedal just yet. The latest rate hike was 25 basis points. We'll probably see at least another 25 basis point hike. And then 6 weeks thereafter, in May, well, it's touch and go whether the Fed will have to raise rates further. Very likely, they will have to take them up to 5% or a little bit above 5%, given that inflation isn't yet moderating. We definitely need to see headline inflation coming off. Headline inflation is still above 6%. If you look at month-on-month change, month-on-month change is running at an annualized pace of around 3.5% annualized. If you look at the last 3 months, the annualized pace is just over 2%. So if the last 3 months are what we can go by, then core PC inflation is already beginning to get closer to where it needs to be. But it's not the month-on-month annualized change that the Fed is targeting. It is the year-on-year, and that year-on-year number needs to be a lot lower than it is at the moment. So there's a fair amount of entrenched inflation. Wage inflation remains quite significant, over 4%. So there is an entrenched amount of inflation in the system, which will require more monetary tightening. And so I think it is now more or less a given that the United States in particular will go into recession in the second quarter. And that recession over the next 3 quarters or so, with economic contraction for second, third, and fourth quarter of this year, will be the only way in which inflation can be brought down. Inflation comes down primarily because you get economic contraction, which results in layoffs, and the unemployment rate begins to rise. That creates some slack in the system and enables wage pressures to ease off, and eventually for headline and core inflation to come off. I mean, that is the scenario that is likeliest, and that is likely to play out over the next few months. The clearest evidence that a recession is imminent are of course 2 things. One, the most clear-cut one has been signaling a recession for some time, and that is the inverted yield curve. When the 10-year yield is lower than the 2-year yield, as it has been consistently since the 5th of July last year, and also briefly in the first 3 or 4 days of April last year. So it's since July, consistently we've had an inverted yield curve, and the current level of that is about minus 0.77 percentage points, which is deeply inverted, and that degree of inversion almost always tells you that a recession is due. The fact that it's been inverted for so long is telling us very clearly that that a recession is imminent. And the second thing that I point to is the ISM manufacturing new orders, and as well as the headline PMI. ISM has been conducting the survey of purchasing managers now for 100 years, except for a brief period during the Second World War. It is a very reliable indicator because those who participate in the survey have been used to doing it, and the conclusions that you can draw from that survey are very meaningful. So the new orders component of the ISM manufacturing index has been below 50 now for 5 months, and anything below 50 is an indication of a downturn 6 months ahead.
Mhm.
So that basically, was already telling us that by April, we will see the US economy start contracting. And the
Okay.
latest number for ISM manufacturing new orders is 42.5. That is extremely low. That is the sort of level that almost always means
Mm.
recession ahead. So we have clear-cut evidence that the U.S.
Mm.
economy is about to enter recession.
Mhm.
It's the toughest way to overcome an inflationary surge. But as I've been pointing out for a while, the 2-year period from March 2020 to February 2022 saw US M2 money supply grow faster year on year every single month than at any time in the previous 80 years.
Mhm.
So when you have that degree of monetary expansion over a 2-year period,
Mhm.
unprecedented pace every month for 2 years, then you are naturally going to get inflation. And in fact, we began to see inflation really pick up from about June of
Mhm.
2021. Core inflation was above 4% by October 2021. And now US money supply is beginning to be squeezed. December was the first month in which M2 money supply contracted. It contracted about 3% year on year.
Mhm.
And that is the beginning. We'll have to see several more months of monetary contraction. Now, monetary
Okay.
contraction has not occurred since the Second World War. That's the first month in which you had money supply contracting. But this unfortunately is the obverse side of that period of nearly 2 years during which you had excessively expansionary monetary policy, and
Mhm.
now we're seeing the obverse side of it. We're seeing some contractionary policy come in, and that I think is inevitably causing the economy to weaken. Now it's a paradoxical situation because the economy is weakening, but the labor market is still tight.
Right.
Part of the reason for that is that the labor force participation rate is more than 4 percentage points lower now than it was in the year before the global financial crisis. In 2008, the labor force participation rate was 66.5. It is now 62.4. So there's been a sharp reduction in the incentive for people in America to participate in the labor force. And the reason for that is that there are very generous unemployment checks being given ever since about 2009, 2010.
Mhm.
Very generous unemployment checks. That's one. Second is that there were large stimulus checks handed out to all citizens of the United States, in especially in 2021. That is in the just before Trump left the White House, he passed a bill in December 2020, and
Mhm.
then in March 2021, President Biden also. So there were two big stimulus checks handed out,
Mhm.
which have gone straight to savings. The consumers have saved those, and since they have these, somewhat bloated savings, as well as very generous unemployment insurance,
Mhm.
there is a disincentive to rejoin the labor force.
Okay. Okay.
Those who don't need to or don't feel a particular desire to rejoin the workforce are staying at home or getting an education or doing other things,
Mhm.
and as a result, the labor market is tight. Uh, Unemployment is at its lowest, uh, pretty much in recorded history for the U.S.
Mhm.
So you have this ironic situation. Uh, Fiscal stimulus that went too far is now having this kind of impact,
Mhm.
and the monetary stimulus also went way beyond anything that had happened in the past, and as a
Mhm.
consequence, needs to contract. So all of this fiscal policy is naturally contractionary now. Monetary policy is aggressively so, and the result is going to be recession. So recession now. I think markets were rather exuberant in the first 6 weeks of this year, anticipating that the US might engineer a soft landing. That is, that they would manage to avert recession and yet bring inflation down. I think that is simply a result of a rebalancing of portfolios that happens at the beginning of each year. At the beginning of each year, people relook at their portfolios, rebalance, and they find that perhaps they were too underweight in some areas. They raise the weights, and markets then do quite well. So I'd say the first 5 or 6 weeks of the year is a bit like the starters. You're getting the appetizers. The real meal is now, from about the middle of February to the middle of May is when you get the real meal. Main course is served in the markets, and the main course is not so tasty this year. So I'd say that the less tasty main course, is now going to come through over the next 3 months. Okay. And it will not be as favorable in markets. Okay. Now, so that's the inflation issue in US. Now, with regard to your second question on China, where does China fit in? Well, from a strategic standpoint, China and the US are at loggerheads. Let's not. There are no two ways about that. And the Chinese have been trying now for about the last 2 or 3 weeks to make friendlier noises towards the West. Wang Yi, the State Counselor for Foreign Affairs, has been on a tour of Europe, and he has been trying to make friendly noises in France and Germany, etc. But just as he was trying to do that, as he had planned to do that, a spy balloon was discovered flying right across the mainland of the United States. It was shot down by the US. And a second spy balloon, most likely, was also shot down. It's not very clear whether the second one was also a spy balloon, but certainly was a Chinese balloon, gathering information over North America. And this has soured relations further. With regard to China's role in Russia, China and Russia, of course, have become very close politically, strategically, over the last 5 or 6 years. But they are also rivals. I think it's important to understand that in Central Asia, Russia has been displaced as the paramount power in places like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Central Asian states, Central European states, Georgia, etc. Georgia and Ukraine are the 2 countries that were former members of the Soviet Union and former members of the pre-Bolshevik Russian Empire that have been attempting to get closer to the West. Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's a conflict going on. Russia used the so-called Belt and Road Initiative of China has encompassed these countries in particular, provided a lot of infrastructure investment in these countries, and has effectively brought them under Chinese hegemony rather than Russian. So there's a rivalry there. And this rivalry is something that is worth taking note of. Now, India has not really participated very much in the great game in Central Asia yet. But there are historic ties. Remember that Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, or the Timurid Empire, was born in the Fargana Valley in what is today Uzbekistan. And before that, many centuries ago, Kanishk was basically a ruler of what is today Pakistan, and primarily he ruled all of what is today Central Asia. So Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc., were part of Kanishka's empire. So we have historic ties. We do have some historic ties, but commercial ties in the modern era are very limited. And so India hasn't really played much of a role in Central Asia yet, but we are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this year we'll be hosting the summit meeting of the SCO. That gives us an opportunity to play a part and to begin to reinforce historic ties with more meaningful commercial ties. But I think there's no getting away from the fact that Central Asia, what used to be Soviet Central Asia, is now very much within the Chinese sphere of influence. And I think India's main opportunity lies in Tibet, where we have much deeper cultural ties. The United States and India could have cooperated in Tibet much more in the 1950s and 60s than we did. At that time, unfortunately, India did not take the opportunity of deepening those ties. And as a result, Tibet has been suppressed and culturally almost destroyed by communist China. The attempt to destroy Tibet culturally has not entirely succeeded, though, and so there are opportunities there. But with regard to China's economic situation today, China is now just coming out of its first proper COVID wave. We don't know the numbers of exactly what has happened. There are substantial reports that about 1.5 million people have died in China over the past month and a half, 2 months. But the economic disruption is more or less done in the sense that Chinese are now beginning, if you look at things like retail sales, they haven't been announced. The final numbers aren't yet out. But what is clear is that there was a real boom in retail sales. There was a boom in internal tourism within China in late January, early February. And that has helped stabilize the Chinese economy. With regard to strategic aspects, the original question, I'd say that the China-US ties are in very bad shape, unlikely to improve anytime soon. And I think the opportunity, therefore, is for India to deepen relationships with some of China's adversaries around the world: the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So, we already have the Quad mechanism as a very good strategic arrangement where we can deepen our relationships. And we've just over the last 3 or 4 days, one of the major suppliers of semiconductor equipment from Japan, Kyocera, says that it's no longer tenable for them to build out additional facilities in China. So any new investments are likely to be either back in Japan or in a third country. Obviously, India is a potential place where some of that investment could go. But in the semiconductor space, we are newcomers. We are latecomers. And of course, there is talk of this huge $21 billion investment by Vedanta and Foxconn in Dholera and the Dholera SIR in Gujarat. If that does come through, that will be really a big development. $21 billion is a massive number. But semiconductors are very capital intensive, very technology intensive, and it's a sector where there's a lot of technological change. So it's a very risky area. But it seems that what Foxconn and Vedanta will be doing will be producing commodity chips, integrated circuits that are application specific, rather than things like microprocessors. So we'll see exactly what emerges from that. But semiconductors are an area where India is still a newcomer and a latecomer. And so I don't think we can immediately replace China as a major semiconductor manufacturing site. The more likely initial places will be Japan and other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as, of course, Korea. Korea is already the world's major producer of memory chips and DRAMs, etc. So there are natural opportunities for investment to go in there. But the fact that US-China ties are deteriorating is generally good news. You will notice that the United States Congress has a bipartisan bill that deprecates and condemns China for its attempts to change the border in Arunachal Pradesh. This is remarkable. The fact that the United States Congress has a solid, very strongly pro-India bill that has bipartisan, almost unanimous support from almost all senators and members of the House of Representatives, supporting the territorial integrity of Arunachal Pradesh within India, and condemning Chinese attempts to change the status quo. So those are positive developments, and I think they present opportunities for India to take advantage of the economic and commercial opportunities that emerge from this goodwill.
So we spoke about the CPI inflation of US, but what about India? We have headline inflation again above the central bank's threshold limit of 6% after 3 months. Will this create an upside risk for interest rates yet again in coming policy of RBI?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it does. It does create some risks of more monetary tightening in India as well. But I think it's important to understand what exactly happened with the January CPI inflation number. By its nature, the consumer price index is an index number series, and an index number series is based on predetermined weights that are fixed.
Right.
So the weight for PDS, public distribution system, rice and wheat are 0.7% and 0.5%. So together, 1.2% of the total weight of the CPI comes from publicly distributed rice, PDS rice and wheat.
Okay.
Now, as of January, nearly over 75% of India's population is now receiving PDS rice and wheat at an even lower price than they were receiving it previously. So they're receiving it near zero, but so there's been if you look at the PDS rice and wheat components of the CPI, they are down sharply in the month of January, down year on year. They're negative number, but the weight is very small. Now, what is interesting, only about a quarter or less, 20 to 25% of India's people are now buying rice and wheat in the open market. But cereals have a weight of over 12% in the CPI. Of that, PDS is supposed to be only 10% of that 12. So it's only 0.12%. Right. Whereas rice and wheat cereals have rice, wheat, and coarse cereals have a weight of over 12% in the CPI. Now, unfortunately, the weights are fixed. So the fact that most people are getting wheat at rice and wheat at a lower price is not being properly reflected in the CPI. Instead, the smaller amount of rice and wheat that is now available in the open market, that is not the PDS market, but in the actual open market, the price of that has gone up.
Right.
And that is has been given too much weight in the CPI basket. And as a result, we are getting a really misleading CPI inflation number for food. Food prices are supposedly going up. Well, other prices are also a little bit higher. But if you look at things like vegetable inflation is negative. There's deflation of vegetable prices. Fruit prices are barely rising. Most other types of food inflation are quite muted, but it is non-PDS, rice and wheat, that have gone up. Actually, non-PDS wheat in particular has gone up the most. And that is why we have so-called, we have this high inflation rate. So I think there are two ways to deal with this. I mean, first of all, January was the first month in which this new system was in place. And perhaps the distribution of non-PDS rice and wheat was a little more chaotic as a result. And perhaps we'll see some moderation in those prices. That's one thing. Second is that if that happens, then there'll be no need to do too much more with regard to monetary policy. That's the wrong response. But the other unfortunate aspect, though, is that actual inflation is not going up, but it is just being reported as being higher. We can't change that, unfortunately, because the nature of the index, any index number series, you have to take fixed weights, and each item has an assigned weight, and that doesn't change. Perhaps the RBI will take cognizance of this. And if they do take cognizance of it, they'll forbear from doing too much. But the ideal solution will be that if in the next couple of months non-PDS cereal prices moderate, then there won't be any real excuse to do more tightening. But the basic point is that overall inflation was on the wane in the previous 2 months, November and December, and there really hasn't been a significant uptick. So if you look at the core inflation rate, it's basically unchanged. It's just over 6, but it's really unchanged. So I think that the fact that it's above 6 is a bit of an issue, but it's not too far above it. And the tightening that has occurred over the last year should begin to ease inflation as we go forward. So I continue to believe that there will be no further rate hikes, but also no chance of any rate cuts in India for the rest of the calendar year. And the main reason that we're going to see better inflation numbers going forward is really that fuel prices will be a lot lower year on year from February, and especially from March onwards. From March onwards, the fuel contribution to inflation will be down quite significantly, and that will help to keep the headline number lower. And of course, if on top of that, if non-PDS wheat and rice prices moderate, that'll help as well. But of course, most likely the next Rabi harvest is going to be very strong. If you look at Rabi crop plantings, they were up very sharply for all the Rabi crops. So from April and May, we'll begin to see inflation moderate quite significantly as the Rabi crop is harvested as well. So the really dangerous period for inflation is the February number, which will come out in March, and then the March number, which will which you'll get some indication of it before the next RBI policy meeting, and so I would expect that the RBI will forbear from raising rates further.
Mhm. Much will also depend upon the monsoon season this time. Various organizations are talking about the El Nino effect this time and maybe a dry spell. So that is one of the key reasons, key things that we will need to watch out for as far as the inflation is concerned. So let's now.
That is of course for much later in the year. The monsoon is going to be a factor for the Kharif crop, and that is some way away. We had some unseasonal rain in October. We had some unseasonal rain across North India and in January as well. But that is actually quite helpful for the Rabi crop. So if anything, the Rabi crop is likely to be strong. If there is a strong El Nino effect, yes, that could have an impact on the monsoon. But I think it's still too early to be talking about the monsoon as a factor because it's been very up and down in the last couple of years. In the end, the monsoons in the last 2 years were above normal, but they were very, very, they were volatile in the sense that there was a period, there's big dry spells in June, and then so there have been it's been a bit up and down, but yes, obviously the monsoon is a factor that is worth paying attention to when the Kharif crop begins to be discussed. Yeah, about 6 months from now.
So monsoon is also following the trend of the markets, deep cuts and deep rises also, sharp rises and deep cuts. So now let's talk about the budget 2023. So what are the key takeaways from the budget this time? GDP growth has been tamed a bit, but at the same time, they are sticking to the fiscal consolidation path. So how do you see the budget, and what is the kind of impact that you see as far as the sectors are concerned in India?
Well, I think the most important takeaways are, first of all, that the budget focused a lot of attention on reaching the last person, on things like the Prime Minister's, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, both the rural as well as the urban parts of that, which basically provides for housing for all. But the really big factor, I think, and then there were measures in there for fishermen, for various, for the rural road program. All of that is socially very positive, but at the same time, there was a huge 33% increase in public expenditure. So the public capital expenditure is up 33%. There's a significant support to the states to also up their capital expenditure, and if they meet certain targets, they get a grant from the center for that capital expenditure. Mm-hmm. And yet, despite all of this, the government is able to reduce the fiscal deficit from a projected 6.4% of GDP this year to 5.9% next year. Now, I think that if you look, and the key reason why they are able to do that is very simple. Nominal GDP is growing very rapidly, far faster than projected in last year's budget. So in last year's budget, the projection was for nominal GDP to grow 11.1%. Actual nominal GDP is now projected to be growing 15.4% in fiscal year 23. Mm-hmm. I think the actual number will be closer to 17% rather than 15.4%. So with that, government revenue, tax revenue in particular, has been growing very, very rapidly, far faster than was originally projected in the budget. So for things like corporate and personal income tax, the original budget had projected growth of 5 or 6% for the year. Year to date, growth is around 20%. For personal and for corporate tax, it's around 25, 26% in the year to date. GST revenues are up 22% in the year to date. So the first 10 months of the fiscal year, you've got GST, corporate and personal income tax revenue growing at about 4 or 5 times as fast in year-on-year terms as they were expected to. And as a result, the fiscal deficit is coming down, and the actual fiscal deficit is now being projected at 6.4%. But the strongest quarter for revenue is the current quarter, January to March, and in particular, the month of March is seasonally the strongest quarter for industrial production, for exports, and for tax revenues. Mm-hmm. So, if there are no disruptions in February and March, then most likely the actual fiscal deficit for FY23 will not be 6.4%. It'll be more like 6% of GDP. And that, and in the year ahead, it'll come down further, to not just 5.9, but quite likely to around 5.5% of GDP. Also helped by the fact that nominal GDP in the projections is projected to only grow 10.4% in FY24. But I think it's much more likely that nominal GDP will continue to grow faster. So if nominal GDP grows faster, you get stronger tax revenue, income tax, corporate tax, and GST, the three largest sources of tax revenue, which contribute about 76% of total revenue. They'll be growing a lot faster than projected, even in the budget. And so you'll get the fiscal deficit continuing to come down. And that strong revenue number helps to provide room for extensive expenditure, both on infrastructure, which is capital expenditure, but also more money for things like subsidies, including the food subsidy, as well as spending on things like the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, rural roads, electrification, completing the last mile for the basic infrastructure rollout to the last person in the economy that is still without the basic amenities of modern living.
Do you think that this budget has given enough to boost consumption in India, more money into the hands of the people?
Well, there is a small reduction in the effective tax rate, particularly if you opt for
the new regime.
The new regime. The new regime, there's a very substantial reduction in effective tax rate. Also, the standard deduction has been, the limit has been raised. So all of that means that the effective taxation rate for individuals has come down, and that should provide a bit of a boost to consumption spending. The strong boost on the rural side, I think there are two things. First of all, the fact that the vast majority of rural residents are getting nearly free rice and wheat means that disposable incomes will be boosted. So in effect, the government is taking on a larger food subsidy. It is buying food from farmers at a relatively high price. It is distributing the food nearly free to about 800. Actually, the exact number is supposed to be 813.5 million people. 813.5 million people are getting nearly free rice and wheat. And that if that program uh, of wheat and rice distribution continues and is effectively implemented, then I think it provides uh, a boost to the effective disposable income of the rural population, and that should provide a boost to rural consumption as well. So the urban consumer benefits from an effective reduction in personal income tax rates. The rural consumer benefits from the fact that they're getting very cheap rice and wheat, and therefore can spend on other things using their incomes and other transfers that they receive.
Any misses in the budget, Mr. Basu?
Sorry, any
misses in the budget?
Any misses? Yes. Well, I think that there are a lot of things in the budget that are focused on trying to boost investment spending. So there are a lot of incentives for private investment, as well as an actual increase for the second consecutive year, more than a 30% increase in public investment. So those are positives. But to me, what is really missing, one thing that I find a little disappointing, is the fact that there isn't enough of a focus on labor-intensive manufacturing.
Sure.
So if you look at labor-intensive exports from India over the last decade, they have stagnated. So there is a production-linked incentive scheme for the apparel sector, garments. There are some PLI schemes for textiles. But the important thing is that this is a very important segment of the economy that isn't doing well. If you look at output, industrial output, the weakest this year is consumer durables. Consumer durables are doing badly, not because of cars. Vehicle output is up strongly. Vehicle sales are up strongly, but the consumer durables that are weak are textiles, garments. Now, towels and things are actually durables. In the US, when you talk about durables, it's dominated by cars. But in India, the durable component, consumer durables, includes things like towels, bed sheets, which are actually consumption items that are durable. They last more than 1 year, right? They last several years. So they are used. They are also consumer durables, and it's that element that is really weak. So not only has textile, cotton and synthetic textiles, as well as garment exports, been pretty stagnant for 10 years. They're doing badly this year too. Sure. That to me is a real worry, because in the medium term, what India needs more than anything else is a boom in labor-intensive manufacturing. If there's a boom in labor-intensive manufacturing, then that will create, hundreds of millions of jobs that are of a far superior quality to the typical agricultural laborers' work that now exists. So if we can get 200, 300 million people away from low productivity or perhaps zero marginal productivity jobs in agriculture, and move them into basic labor-intensive manufacturing, the productivity of each individual will go up by 4 or 5 times. And productivity basically means you also get wages that go up 4 or 5 times. And as a consequence of that, you will see a huge boost to the economy over the medium term. That, unfortunately, is the one thing that didn't see any focus in the budget this year, or in fact, even last year. I think this government is doing a fair amount to create a social security system that encompasses the unorganized worker. But those are very positive things that governments in the past have neglected. So those are positives. But unless you get a labor-intensive manufacturing revolution, we are going to really, miss this huge opportunity, especially at a time like this when China's labor-intensive manufacturing is unviable, and yet China exports 8 to 9 times the textiles and garments that India does. So if China is doing 8 to 9 times the amount of textile and garment exports that India does, if India is able to capture half of China's share, say, over the next 5 years, India's textile and garment exports would have quintupled over that period. So that is the nature of the opportunity that exists, but is being missed at the moment. And unfortunately, there isn't anything specific in the budget to encourage this. There is, of course, legislation to change the labor codes that has been passed, but it still needs to be notified. But anyway, that's not a budget issue. If there were some incentives for labor-intensive manufacturing, I would have welcomed them in the budget. So if you ask me about a miss, that's the miss.
Right. We have a couple of questions, Mr. Basu, that we have received in our comment section. Gaurav has a question. Will low interest rates become a thing of the past in India?
Well, it depends on what you mean by low interest rates. Yes, the fact that interest rates are now back to where they were in 2019 means that they are, of course, quite a bit higher than they were during the COVID period. But the COVID period was an unusual period. If we can get inflation down to 4% on a more sustained basis, then interest rates will come down again. But at the moment, we have a global inflationary challenge. All over the world, inflation is quite high. And India has done a little bit better than the rest of the world in containing inflation. But inflation is still, in the 6% range, which is too high. With inflation at 6%, you're not going to get, India cannot afford to bring the policy interest rate below 6%. So 6.5% policy rate, unfortunately, is going to be there. So I would suggest that the best way to respond to this is to put some more of your savings in fixed deposits, particularly for the next year or so. Given that you're getting a positive inflation adjusted return.
True.
And that return will improve over the next few months because I think inflation will come down.
Abdul Sheikh has a question. Sectors expected to do well in the current market scenario?
Well, I think the sectors that should do well are particularly things that like capital goods, where you're going to see a substantial investment spurt coming through. You have both public investment picking up and private investment turning around. So anything to do with capital goods, construction, and those sorts of areas are likely to do better. And the fact that the rupee has depreciated over the past 3 months. Now, notice that between February 2022 and October 2022, the rupee had appreciated against the euro, the pound, the Japanese yen, the Korean won, Chinese renminbi.
Right.
But in the last 3 months, it has depreciated against all of them and depreciated a bit against the US dollar as well. So I would say that exports, the export-oriented sector is likely to do better going forward. So in the next 6 months, I would be quite positive on the software and IT services sector because that has underperformed also during this period of rupee strength. We'll see some improvement there going forward. So I'd say that those are the two areas. Yeah.
And the budget thrust on infrastructure would also have some impact on ancillary sectors like cement.
Absolutely. Yeah. So by
Beer.
capital goods and
Yeah.
construction related, I of course include
Mhm.
cement.
Mhm. Mr. Basu, economic crisis in Pakistan. What will that mean for India? Advantage to India?
Well, there's a crisis in Pakistan. It's not of much of an advantage to India. I mean, uh, it's a neighboring country, and the fact that they are in crisis is nothing to gloat about. But it is a crisis that has been long in coming. Yeah, Pakistan has had to turn to the IMF about 24 times in its history, and it's turning to the IMF again this time. It's almost run out of foreign exchange reserves. The Pakistan rupee has collapsed. So essentially, in our neighborhood, we have two countries now, Pakistan and Sri Lanka,
Sri Lanka.
that should now learn a lesson that being too friendly to China is a disaster.
True.
See, Pakistan has taken far too much credit from China. It is hugely indebted to China, and it is unable to repay uh, debts either to China or to others. So now it is turning to the rest of the world, asking the IMF to rescue it, and it is getting a little bit of help from the IMF, but only modest amount of help. Instead, they are facing uh, a crisis that is that ultimately arises from the fact that they've taken too much too much debt from China, and given that China does not want to participate in so-called Paris Club negotiations, what happens is that when a country is on the verge of bankruptcy, the Paris Club, which is a group of sovereign entities, sovereign country lenders to an indebted country, they meet and they try to restructure the debt. What they do is basically they agree together to forgive some of the debt because the chances of the country repaying it are very low. Now, at the moment, both Pakistan and Sri Lanka have a problem because the major creditor is China, and China is unwilling to forgive any debt. Right. Because China has a clause in its loans to these countries under which if you don't repay, if you can't repay, then China will do a so-called debt for equity swap. What they'll do is they'll convert the debt into ownership of assets in your country. So that happened with Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka and Hambantota Airport. Those are assets that were created in the Rajapaksa family homeland. The Rajapaksa family's constituency is Hambantota. In that constituency, 68 square miles at least is now Chinese territory for the next 99 years. And there will probably be similar clauses in loans to China. Most likely, Gwadar Port, which was originally owned by Oman, it was leased by the Khan of Kalat to Oman until 1958. And it then became part of China, part of Pakistan in 1958. And now is about to perhaps become Chinese territory in the same way as Hambantota. So now other creditors to Pakistan are probably unwilling to allow such clauses to be given precedence over theirs. I mean, all lenders generally believe that they are equal to each other and should be treated as such by the borrower. But China wants to be treated as a superior level creditor. And that is part of the reason for the crisis. Now, of course, ultimately the crisis in Pakistan is that they haven't got a wide enough set of exports that can be competitive. Unfortunately, over the last 20 years, Pakistan has perhaps focused too much on exporting terrorism rather than goods and services. And so now they're paying the consequences. That being the case, this is a difficult conjuncture for the Pakistani economy. Just as because Pakistan has nuclear weapons and is seen as strategically very important for the likes of Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. They will try and keep it afloat. But nonetheless, this is a challenging situation for them. And I don't look at it as much of an opportunity for India. I mean, in fact, in some ways, the rapid depreciation of the Sri Lankan rupee and the Pakistan rupee is putting some pressure on some of India's commodity exports. So the likes of tea, India's very small part of India's exports is tea exports, less than 2%. But when the Sri Lankan rupee has depreciated so much, it becomes very, very cheap relative to Indian tea. Similarly, some types of goods, sporting goods, footballs, for instance, most of the footballs for the World Cup were made either in India or in Pakistan. So now, the Pakistani version will be cheaper, a lot cheaper, given the depreciation of the rupee. So there is some slightly negative impacts, which will play out over the medium term. But in the short term, I think the economic instability in Pakistan is bad, because China is very exposed there, as well as to several of the countries that have defaulted in Africa. Ghana, for instance, has been a defaulter, and the largest single creditor to Ghana also was China.
Thank you so much, Mr. Basu, for being with us. Pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank all our viewers for watching this special session. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and please post your queries in the comment section below. Also, let us know any other topic that you would want us to take up in our coming sessions. Thank you once again for watching.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to never miss an update from ICICI Direct.